What's up, my fellow Shield Brothers? It is Shield Brothers 6 for the History Armada back again. We are here on this wonderful day to start a new part of that series I mentioned, where we are going to start with the tales and myths. So we are going to start with some of my personal favorites, the tales and sagas of the Norse beliefs. So Norse mythology, or Asatru, whatever you want to call it, formed one of the centerpieces of the pagan Norse religion. These are the tales that the Viking Poets, also known as skalds, which are the equivalent of a bard for most sense, from the historical standpoint, in the longhouses and the mead halls and the feasting halls, they would captivate the attendees with these tales and recollections of stories at these grand feasts. And these are also the tales that would be passed down orally from mother and father to children around the hearth fires and, house fires on long winter nights, etc. These are the tales that would be held in tradition and passed down mainly orally. They are epic myths of war, magic, love, betrayal, triumph, and ruin. Not only did they provide deep wells of religious meaning for the Vikings, but they also speak much of the timeless and universal ideas of the human condition. Because if you look at these stories, especially with the tale that we're going to talk about today, with the creation story, a lot of different beliefs and civilizations had very similar tales and myths, and a lot of them overlap at different points. So since the pre-Christian Norse never really wrote down their myths or tactics or stories, theirs was almost exclusively an oral culture. The primary sources upon which our current knowledge of Norse mythology were all well written while the Norse were converting to Christianity. A lot of the sagas and tales and myths that we have today, the versions that we have, mainly come from the Christian scholars who recorded them much after the original creation or the original events, if we're talking about the Icelandic sagas and such. The Old Norse Eddas and sagas may not be pure in their recollection, but they nevertheless contain much that certainly is an authentic portrayal of the Viking Age and their beliefs. And in this case, that's what we're going to be going off of today. So a really good book that I highly recommend that I actually have is The Viking Spirit by Daniel Mccoy. His version of the myths, he has a very well written collection of the myths and sagas of the Norse, and it's what I'm going to be mainly pulling from today. So chronologically speaking, Norse mythology has a clear beginning in the creation myth and a clear ending in the tale of Ragnarok. But most of what happens in between those two bookends don't really occur in any particular order for the most part, and they certainly doesn't follow a strict linear trajectory or arcing storyline. Sometimes we find that myth A assumes that myth B had already been taken when talking about prior events and how these characters had already gotten there. The Viking and Norse mind didn't demand the same kind of strict rational codification and linear timeline as the modern West does. So that does greatly influence how the stories can be told and when. I will be telling the Norse myths every week, or other folklore every week, orally recollecting them just like they used to. I will be recollecting them for you. I can be your skald. But this is another one of my passions. I actually am a European history major. I actually have a BA in European history now, which is weird to say. But my favorite time period is actually I would say, early Middle Ages and the Viking Age. I love the history of the British Isles. I love the Norse history, the Irish history, mainly because it has to do with a lot of my own beliefs and my personal ancestry. But that's neither here nor there. Today's myth, we are going to start at the beginning and work our way through them. So today's story is the saga of the creation of the cosmos. So the Norse creation myth, or cosmogony, an account of the origins of the cosmos, is perhaps one of the richest, in my opinion, of creation stories. It's very interesting in its portrayal of the cosmos and how it came to be. So let's begin. The origin of the cosmos. And that's going to pertain to this image here to my left, or your right. Before there was soil and sky, before there was anything at all in space, when it was all but a gaping abyss known as Gunagakap, this chaos of perfect silence and darkness, there was overlapping darkness, nothing but silence, and the two realms, the land of elemental fire, Muspelheim, and the homeland of the elemental ice, Niflheim. Frost from Niflheim and billowing flames from Muspelheim would creep towards each other, back and forth, quite often, until they met in the Gunagap. Amid the hissing and the sputtering, the fire melted the ice over time. Then, as the ice melted, the drops formed themselves into a being. Ymir, the Screamer, the first of the godlike, the giants, the Jotun. He is the first and the king of the Jotun. Ymir was a hermaphrodite and could reproduce asexually, and that's where a lot of the giants come from. When he slept, more Jotun leapt forth from his legs and from the sweat of his armpits. And the sweat droplets from his legs and armpits would birth all these different Jotun, and every night as he slept, the Jotun would pop forth, and more Jotun would spring forth into being. As the frost continued to melt over time due to Niflheim, a cow, Udholma, I'm probably saying that wrong, emerged from it. She nursed Ymir with her milk, and they became a duo. Her licks slowly gave him nourishment with her milk, and in turn, she was nourished by the salt licks in the ice from his sweat. So he would get milk and she would get licks of salt from him to survive off of. Her licks slowly uncovered another being, Bjori, the first of the Aesir tribe of the gods, the Pro-Geneter. Bjori was a son named Bor, which also means son, who married Besla, the daughter of the giant Boltorn. The half-god, half-giant child of Bor and Besla were three of the Aesir. Three very important of the Aesir. Odin, who became the chief of the Aesir gods, the very highest of them, and his two brothers, Vili and Ve. Odin, Vili, Ve sprang forth from this nourishment and this relationship between Besla and Boltorn. From Besla and Bor. Odin and his brothers slew Ymir as he slept one night, and set about constructing the world from his corpse. They knew that Ymir was too powerful to let be, so, upon seeing the Jotun go back to sleep once more, they sprang upon him, as you see here in this image. Odin in the middle there, and his brothers Vili and Ve. Ymir awoke, and he was slain. They fashioned the oceans of the world, the very oceans, the vast oceans, the Atlantic, the Pacific, all of the oceans, from the blood of Ymir. The soil was made from his skin and muscles. The vegetation on the earth was made from the very hairs of Ymir. Clouds were born from where his brains had been, and the sky from his very skull. 4 dwarves, corresponding to the 4 cardinal points, the 4 directions, held Ymir's skull aloft above the earth. And that is how we got the atmosphere, with the skull pertaining the sky for us. The gods eventually formed the first man and woman as well from Ymir, Ask and Embla, from 2 tree trunks that had been born from the muscles of Ymir. And they also built a fence around their dwelling place, Midgard, to protect them from the Jotun born of Ymir. And that is how we were given the creation of the cosmos, as Odin and his brothers slayed the great giant Ymir. So now let's talk about what that meant, and the history about it, as well as the thematics. So, order from chaos is a big point for this. There was nothing but the dark chaos. Thematically, Ymir is the personification of that chaos, literally born from the darkness between the fiery hells and the icy hells of Niflheim and Niflheim. Both Ymir and Gunagap are always, in a way, a form of talking about the limitless potential that isn't actualized yet. So it's these particular things that can come together. This is why it's very interesting that the darkness upon the darkness was able to create life. And it's kind of similar to the first chapter of Genesis in a way, when there is darkness and then from that becomes something. It is extremely fitting for Ymir to be the progenitor of all the giants, for this is a general role the giants occupy in Norse myth. They are the forces of formless chaos. When you think of praying to the gods, you pray to a thing, and then if you were to observe the Jotun, it would be like observing a tornado. Powerful, yes, but orderless chaos. They are that force, and they are in turn going to overturn what the gods created at the end times of Ragnarok. But the giants are more than just forces of destruction, as shown in this story, as they can also create, and the raw materials from which they create. Ymir, being an example, yes, he was slain, but his body was used to create everything, literally everything. The Norse saw the gods as the pillars and the vital forces that held the cosmos together. So when the gods created the world, they imparted both order and sanctity into it from that orderless chaos. And from that, the Vikings and the Norse were able to see in their own worldview that the world is a battleground between the gods and the giants, within a giant, in a way, whose power is more or less evenly matched, like the forces of nature. So the creation for their Norse world would make sense to reflect that, as we see in this myth, as in this the story. So, additionally, the Vikings, like the other Germanic peoples, were and are notorious for their eagerness for battle. It should become little surprise to anyone that recognizes the Vikings or know of the Germanic tribesmen, therefore, that the conflict is such a central theme in their creation myth. The very creation of the cosmos comes from conflict, as Ymir is slain by Odin, Vili, and Ve. And the conflict itself is a generative force as it creates everything. So, in order for the gods to fashion the world, they had to first slay Ymir. This is the first intentional taking of a life in the universe. Everything before this, in the Norse understanding, was creation. This is the first slaying and taking of a life. It isn't presented as a crime or a sin even, as it is perhaps in a biblical myth of Cain and Abel. There is no sin or cruelty in this death that is mentioned. Rather, it's a good and even a kind of a sacred task, as Daniel Mccoy puts it, because from that death comes the creation of the cosmos, and accomplishing a great deed out of it. So the gods forming the world from the corpse of a being of chaos is a fairly common element in myths, but the precise set of meanings containing to such an act it varies from culture to culture. So the glorification of this honorable aggression is a way of setting the status on this defining act, as the meaning of the Vikings found in their particular myth, as they also were people of war and raid. And I find it very particular such a gruesome depiction of the creation of the cosmos, because they literally pulled out his innards, and made them into the very earth and soil. They pulled the hair from his head and made vegetation. Odin brained him with his spear, with his weapon. I don't think he had a spear yet, or as I said, it's not a linear, so he could have his spear. But I digress. When Odin struck him with the final blow, his brains became the very clouds of the earth. So such a gruesome act is the creation of chaos, but it's the creation of everything from chaos. And I just find that very unique. So that's today's myth. That is the creation of the cosmos as the Norse believe it. And I hope you kind of enjoyed that little recollection and explanation. I also hope that you learned a little something about the Norse beliefs and perhaps Ymir and the creation of the cosmos. If you have an idea of how I can do this different next time, or an idea for what I should talk about next, please leave that in the comments. If you like, go ahead and like. If you don't, go ahead and leave a dislike. But until next time, this is ShieldBrothers 6 for the History Armada, and I'll catch y'all next time.